We are joined by Dr. Akmal Makhdum, consultant psychiatrist, to discuss the world issue of coronavirus. Dr. Akmal, what is the psyche regarding coronavirus?
There isn't a particular psyche regarding coronavirus. It is like any other existential threat that groups face. Like there was the plague and the earlier centuries, the other afflictions that befell humanity. So, what we see is that there are different ways that different groups respond. So, there isn't a particular stereotype that determines how people will respond. People in England in various backgrounds of various groups, various areas behave in a different manner. People in France have behaved in a different manner. In Italy, in Pakistan, in other Asian countries. So it all depends on what cultural context and what belief context you come from. So I would say generally that those who are less educated societies, more traditional societies, have dealt with it in a laissez faire approach, in an approach which is not too frantic and too frenzied. I would say that societies which are less educated in the modern context and more traditional and based on more um, archety- archetypal in the sense that they are more paternalistic and more religious have dealt with it in an approach where they either project as a curse from God and it is as a punishment of sins that the society has created, and there isn't a much organized response. Whereas in societies which are contemporary, modern, more scientific, the approach has been far more structured and far more organized. And in societies which are more controlled, like in China, where one authority can assert a great degree of control, they have been able to manage it in the way they have been able to manage it. And other societies like Italy, and they have seen a gradual resurgence of that authoritarian approach that they've locked the whole thing down. And so basically, I would say that there are mixtures of reactions that people have shown.
Okay, you mentioned that more traditional, maybe more religious, conservative countries have dealt with it in a more laissez-faire approach, whereas you see countries in Europe, for example, they're shutting their borders down. However, they seem to be the ones that have now seemed to have controlled the situation comparatively to when they first had their onset. So, for example, South Korea, Indonesia, and other such countries, they've managed to, comparatively to the initial onset, have managed to control the figures, whereas you see in Italy, it's doubling and tripling overnight. Where you would imagine maybe if it was Europe, they would have a greater control on the situation, but it doesn't seem to be the case.
I won't call South Korea as a traditional, less educated society. South Korean society has always been extremely organized, extremely disciplined, extremely hygienic, and very, very traditional in the sense that they have looked at authority with reverence. So, South Korea is not a good example. I would say that if you wanted to use an example, Uganda could be another example, or Pakistan could be another example, or India possibly may be another example of those um, less educated, less organized societies. I would say that Indonesia is a far more educated and far more organized society. Indonesia has a very high rate of literacy. They have a high regard for authority, and they also have a very high percentage of women who are extremely empowered. So, societies where you have greater education and a respect for authority have dealt with it in a far better manner compared to societies which are not organized and not very well educated and more traditional in the religious sense. Indonesia has certain factors which are traditional in terms of religiosity, but it also has a proactive aspect of a very highly educated and authority respecting society. Whereas in countries like Pakistan, uh, the education is not the stronger point of society, and also it is traditional and religious. So, lack of education and traditional religious thinking actually creates a potential mixture for potentially disorganized reaction.
Okay, so you've used that, the certain those continent countries and those continents. But how about looking at the developed world? Education levels in, according to figures, are, what the world aims to be. The rest of the countries, underdeveloped countries. England, for example, hasn't been able to contain the situation. France has been unable to contain the situation. America, where everyone goes for their education, where that's the heart of literature, etc., or learning, should I say, they have not been able to control the situation. So the statement you just made, it doesn't seem to cover that.
Click, exactly. Yeah, I mean, the point is that we need to look at this as an ongoing process. If we look at all other ongoing processes, uh, unless it totally flusters everybody and totally transforms itself in a new phenomenon in the history of mankind. But all those societies which have traditionally in the last 200 years dealt with scenarios with education, with discipline, with control in a manner where they are dealing with these things in a more structured way, they have dealt with it in a far more organized way. What I would say is that, yes, in the first instance, the difference between England and the rest of Europe is that England has been a far more relaxed society compared to the rest of Europe. There's a huge cultural difference between France and Germany and England. There's a huge difference between mainland Eastern Europe and England. So England has been a far more open, far more tolerant, far more relaxed society compared to many other mainland countries. So I would say that that has probably reflected on the English approach where people are criticizing it. But all I'm trying to say to you is that this is the first little wave, as you said earlier, that this is the first wave. It is the beginning of this particular process. We are hoping that X will happen and Y will happen and it will result in a Z, but it may not. So, if we look at an ongoing wave, which are societies which are beginning to deal with it, beginning to approach it in a more serious manner. So, if we are looking at a similar scenario, Iran is one scenario which has proved a massive challenge to its structure and its ability to control it, although they're taking it very seriously. Whereas in terms of Italy, they also have a similar scenario and they have not been able to deal with it. And I think the Italian approach has also played a role in that because the Italian approach is generally laissez faire, generally relaxed. about everything.
Yeah, so now they're on lockdown, so the country has
Now they
become.
are coming to that other extreme,
Yeah.
which we see in Italian history. That on the one hand, you can have a highly cultural and artistic Italy, and on the other hand, you have the right wing movements burgeoning in Italy. So I would say that I would link it with the psyche of the nation as well.
Right. So now let's bring it down to a more of a micro level where we are seeing the reactions of people within these countries. So let's discuss UK because that's where you are. Bulk buying certain items like toilet paper, pasta, etc. The national approach, which we just discussed, the national psyche or the international psyche, how is that having an effect on the micro level?
I think that there isn't a panic, but there is a concern. As far as buying toilet papers are concerned, I don't know how that is going to help. Water does. So the traditional Asian manner of ablution and cleanliness is proving to be more effective. So I would say that people have their own ideas about how they should approach it. I have not seen, at least in the semi rural aspect of East Anglia, a panic. People are beginning to take it seriously. People are still relaxed. I've not seen masks anywhere. Whether they should be or they shouldn't be, that's another approach. But of course, they haven't really started the personal space or personal distancing or social distancing so far. So there is that more relaxed British approach about it compared to the black and white scenario that we may see elsewhere. So I would say that yes, there is some concern, but you do not see a lack of food, you do not see panic buying, although there is there is, I would say, excessive buying of certain products, but you don't see empty shelves of food stuff. You do not see a general fear and fright. People are beginning to take some precautions.
And as a psychiatrist, do you think that's the right approach?
Well, as a psychiatrist, obviously the I'm unable to comment on the vectoring and the epidemiology and how a an epidemic or a pandemic may behave. But all I'm trying to hint at is that the psyche will determine how you deal with it.
So now, how do you think the media plays a role in all of this? Because that's where everyone's getting the information. Plus, now the social media platforms where
Yeah.
there's even excess. I mean, real media has false information too,
Yeah,
but
I think that there needs to be an understanding of this. That there'll be two factors. Um, the commercial media will look at information plus a degree of business. So certain sensational pieces of news would sell more, will be more beneficial for business. So there will be some information or aspects of information which will be tinged with that. Whereas if it's just plain state media, ratings and other sensationalism may not play a role into it. Social media, people have to discern that it is entirely a free, uncontrolled, unverified, unresourced scenario in which anybody who can think of anything will bring in. Now, there's an interesting aspect, of social media. I've seen people saying that if you recite these particular verses of these particular holy scriptures so many hundreds of times every day, you won't get infected. Then I see people saying use garlic and lemon and so on, and you won't get infected. Then some people are saying these natural herbs and plants may help you, and some people are actually using animal excreta to say that if you use this. So I would say that as far as social media is concerned, that's something that one has to once again rely on one's own ability to discern and self analyze or be critical.
But when most people, majority of people don't know how to do that, which is why we see a lot of issues regarding social reactions or opinions. How do we deal with that? Because people
That's
take
about
things at
self
face value.
education. That's about self education. That at a micro level cannot be dealt with an external agency. The only thing an external agency can do is that the commercial media should balance rating versus information, because of course some news are more sellable compared to others, and the state media must fix itself on actual basic information. And I think that each individual will make a judgment based on their own knowledge, on their own temperament, and on their own anxieties. Why is it that people are buying it? It is more to do with the degree of one's own anxiety. If somebody goes and is degree X anxious, he'll go and maybe buy 12 packs of tissue rolls. But there is another person who's extremely anxious, will go and buy 20 rolls. So that is why you see that in certain shops and stores, they've actually created a quota that for one particular person, there'll be two antiseptic lotions and so on. And because one's own individual anxiety can have a direct impact on the other person's ability to purchase a health product.
Okay. So now just linking it back to the situation in the early 20th century, the 1918 influenza pandemic, also known as the Spanish flu, where 500 million people around the world were infected. Infected and affected by this. About 27% of the then population, between 1.8 billion and 1.9 billion, including people who were isolated on islands. Now, one would hope since then, 100 years late, over 100 years later, that we have better resources and knowledge to deal with it. However, the discussion in the media suggests that we will be going to warlike status at some point, where people are recommended to stay at home, what you mentioned earlier about social distancing. Why are our reactions as human beings so similar to what they were over a century ago?
Okay. The thing is that past, unless it is relevant to the individual, has no real impact. So if this thing had happened in my lifetime, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I would have learned something from it. 100 years ago is non existent for me. It's just something that happened. I don't know, nobody survives to tell me. My parents aren't here to tell me, or my grandparents aren't here to tell me. This is before my parents, maybe during my grandparents' time. So that past has zero relevance. So that is one. That is how memory works. Because it is not part of my memory, it has no impact. That's one. Number two is that world has transformed. Knowledge has increased, so has population. Environment has changed totally. The mutation of viruses has changed.
Yeah.
So what I would say is that it is going to be the same. Why was there the First World War and within a lifetime there was a Second World War? Because for a particular generation, the First World War had zero impact on them. So I would say that that's where learning has to have a relevance to the individual. and the group.
Okay, and so finally, for this part of our discussion on coronavirus, what would you like to leave everyone else? What would you like to leave everyone a point to take home with them from this conversation today?
I don't think that there is a particular point that I would like to leave, except that do your research and be critical of all your research and see whether you are magnifying your anxiety or you're minimizing your anxiety. So I think a degree of self reflection is important. Why? Because my actions will have an impact on my neighbor's ability to protect himself.
And next time, what we'll discuss is how to reflect on our own behaviors and our anxieties regarding the situation in order to balance out and have a more balanced view
Okay.
and approach. Thank you.